Metamodernism is, I think it's a reaction to postmodernism. So postmodernism, I think the longer it's gone on, the more people feel that it just isn't sustainable as a worldview and as an aesthetic. It doesn't make for enjoyable narratives necessarily because of this detachment and this kind of self-aware cynicism. That's not an enjoyable, sustainable way of looking at the world, because I think inherently as humans we want hope. We want to believe that there's something to construct and everything isn't just deconstruction, right? We want to believe there are answers, there are truth. And so metamodernism, I think, is a reaction against postmodernism, saying maybe that went too far, or maybe there's some aspects of modernism that we do want to retain, even while there are some aspects of postmodernism that have been helpful correctives against kind of maybe the excesses and the potential problems of modernism. So I think metamodernism is really just the natural kind of attempt to synthesize what came before modernism and postmodernism.
In today's episode, we're talking about metamodernism. What is it? If you have no clue, this is a good introduction for you, but I also have, over on the audio-only side of my podcast, I've got a lecture series I did a year ago on metamodernism. I think it's a really helpful introduction to the subject matter, and we talk about different expressions of metamodernism in film, in television, that can give you a good idea of what those essential flavors are of metamodernism. You can find a link for that below in the description. It's totally, completely free. I think they're pretty decent lectures that can help you on the subject. Of course, in the back catalog, I also have interviews with other guests. There are some other videos on my YouTube channel addressing metamodernism, including the metamodern resurgence of the band Creed. It's something I predicted would happen, and it ended up happening, which was really cool, really fun. Today's guest, who's here to help us navigate this subject, is a wonderful writer and author by the name of Brett McCracken. Brett is also the senior editor and director of communications over at the Gospel Coalition, and he's authored books such as The Wisdom Pyramid, Feeding Your Soul in a Post-Truth World, and Uncomfortable, the Awkward and Essential Challenge of Christian Community. Welcome to today's podcast, Brett McCracken. As you've been looking around going, it seems like something different is going on. When did you first start noticing this shift? What terminology have you used to describe it? And what do you see as kind of causing this shift?
Yeah, I think I first started noticing it years before I was aware of the term metamodernism. So I think I've been a film critic for 20 years, basically, and been a close follower of cinema during those 2 decades. And so I think I probably started noticing what I now would categorized as meta-modern cinematic storytelling in the early 2000s, I would say, like, the films of Wes Anderson, Spike Jonze, some of Tarantino's films, this transition from postmodern film, which was a big thing in the 90s, kind of late 90s into the aughts, but then becoming something that was a little bit different than mere postmodern storytelling, and was kind of infusing this sincerity into it and this mix of kind of sweet, earnest storytelling that felt like, modernist, but also a postmodern awareness and kind of a self-awareness of we're a film and we know we're a film and we know you know that we're a film, and yet we still want you to enjoy this sweet story that we're telling. That was something that I was noticing in a lot of films, and I think there's probably countless films I could list over the last 20 years that would fall into that category. So I've I've been aware of what's happening for a while, but the term metamodernism, when I first came across, I think it was a Luke Turner essay about it a couple years ago, and then a video essay by Thomas Flight, which I thought was really helpful. It gave me like a category that made sense of it, and so I think it's a really helpful category for us to make sense of what has been happening for a while now, And even though there's still modernist films, right? We still have straightforward modernist films like the Top Gun Mavericks of the world. We still have maybe straightforward postmodernist films, but more and more you're seeing this mix, this kind of like hybrid of both, which is what we call metamodernism. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, so you've given a term metamodernism here that regular listeners to this program would be familiar with. I've done a lecture series about it in the past. I've had people like Brendan Graham Dempsey on, and Brendan is, I think, on YouTube in particular. He's done a lot of writing, and Brendan will have to forgive me for not remembering the exact names of his books, but he's written on the subject pretty extensively as well. So regular viewers and listeners have some familiarity. But because I think it is still, in some ways, it feels like the cement is still wet on trying to identify the flavors of
Mm-hmm.
metamodernism. And I've used the word flavors because it seems a little bit different from what we experienced with like postmodern film, postmodern television, where from my vantage point, Brett, and you can give me pushback on this if you'd like, but from my vantage point, it often felt like with postmodern film and postmodern storytelling, you already had maybe a loose configuration, although I don't know if there was ever here's the postmodern school of thought, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
there has been postmodern philosophers or philosophers that people would identify as
Yeah.
postmodern, even if they didn't necessarily take on that label for themselves. And oftentimes it felt like you could really clearly identify. You take a film like The Matrix, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of philosophical influences in The Matrix, but you could specifically name some of the direct philosophical influences in terms of like philosophers and their specific works were really clearly visible on display. With metamodernism, I haven't noticed that as much. And there seems like it's almost this is more organically emerging in pop culture than it
Yeah.
is from like the academy and then trickling down into pop culture. Is that your read on it as well?
That is my read on it, and I think that's typically how it happens. Academics are good at observing trends in culture and the arts and then creating taxonomies and labels and categories for it. But I don't think it happens that the academics come up with the idea first and then it trickles down to the artists. Maybe it's a conversation and it happens both ways. And I'm sure there are some filmmakers out there who are aware of metamodernism as a philosophical
Right.
idea and who are self-consciously making films that kind of evoke that. But I would wager that there's far more filmmakers out there who are just doing their thing as it feels kind of they're expressing their way of looking at the world. And it just happens to take on this meta modern flavor because that's what's in the air in our culture. So yeah, I think it's more of an organic phenomenon culturally that um, academics just kind of help explain.
Yeah. Okay. So we've used three categorizations already thus far: modern, postmodern, and metamodern. And again, those that have maybe gone through my lecture series or have some prior even undergrad engagement with philosophy might be familiar with the first two terms. How do you understand
Hmm.
modernism, postmodernism, before we even try to kind of pick apart the flavors of metamodernism?
Hmm.
Maybe give the audience your understanding of what, especially when it comes to storytelling, film, and the arts.
Yeah.
What are the flavors of modernism? What are the flavors of
Yeah.
postmodernism for those that might not be familiar with those categorizations?
Yeah, I like the word flavors because I think that's a good way to describe an aesthetic or in like art forms like cinema. I think the modernist film has a flavor of sincerity. It's a flavor of kind of more straightforward, immersive storytelling where you want the audience to just be sincerely bought into the world of this film, immersed in it, believing in a um, kind of real virtues, real heroes, real villains. There's a kind of certainty, a vocabulary of certainty in modernist films. Postmodernism is in many ways the opposite. The flavor. Postmodern films have a flavor of cynicism and kind of detached awareness of the illusions of truth and the illusions of hope. And narratives aren't straightforward, they're deconstructed. You notice that in like Tarantino's films, right? He famously kind of took the traditional story arc and totally deconstructed it, almost in the way that Picasso did with painting, right? Just kind of mashed it up, put the ending at the beginning, and so on and so forth. So postmodernism is ironic, it's detached, it's deconstructionist. There isn't The goal isn't to bring the audience into a fully bought in, all in, immersive experience in a story that they can really believe in. It's to give audiences this entertaining awareness that
Mhm.
you are watching a film and we're deconstructing the film in the film itself. Metamodernism is kind of, I think it's a reaction to postmodernism. So postmodernism, I think, the longer it's gone on, the more people feel that it just isn't sustainable as a worldview and as an aesthetic. It doesn't make for enjoyable narratives necessarily because of this detachment and this kind of self-aware cynicism. That's not an enjoyable, sustainable way of looking at the world, because I think inherently as humans we want hope. We want to believe that there's something to construct and everything isn't just deconstruction, right? We want to believe there are answers, there are truth. And so metamodernism, I think, is a reaction against postmodernism, saying maybe that went too far, or maybe there's some aspects of modernism that we do want to retain, even while there are some aspects of postmodernism that have been helpful correctives against kind of the maybe the excesses and the potential problems of modernism. So I think metamodernism is really just the natural kind of attempt to synthesize what came before modernism and postmodernism. And
Yeah.
I have opinions. We can get into this later about whether or not the metamodern project is ultimately sustainable itself and
Mm.
coherent.
Yeah.
And I think that it's kind of a little bit of a have your cake and eat it too approach that doesn't quite add up to something something coherent. But a lot of metamoderns would say that that's fine. Coherence isn't the point, and in fact, a worldview that accommodates discontinuity and seeming contradictions is what they're going for. That's
Mm.
what metamodernism kind of embraces.
Yeah, okay. I do want to put a pin in that and circle back around to it because I would like to help the audience maybe grapple with the reasons why there have been even you might say like dialogical tensions that
Hmm.
create these shifts in
Yeah.
our cultural grammar and shifts in these cultural texts. In particular, I'd like to go back a little bit to understanding the tension between the modern and the postmodern, because as I hear you describe the modern storytelling, sincerity, right? It is a story that typically the modern story was something that wasn't as suspicious about overarching guiding stories, overarching
Hmm.
worldviews and narratives.
Yeah.
And so it gave you a story you could live in. It gave
Hmm.
you a story that was still distinctly modern from my vantage point. So the flavors of modernist post enlightenment philosophy were embedded into these stories. You mentioned Top Gun Maverick. For me, like the original OG Top Gun, that's a great
Hmm.
example of a
Hmm.
modern story
Yeah.
telling. And I've talked about this before, but I don't even think you can fully appreciate how if you were to maybe go back, let's say 600, 700 years, a
Hmm.
story like Top Gun would not be well received, obviously, aside from technology that didn't exist
Right.
600, 700 years ago. To
Hmm.
me, I see this as it's downstream of even the Reformation. For me, I see without Luther in many ways to me is a maverick character. You know, he is saying there
Hmm.
is something wrong with these institutions, the institution of the Roman Catholic Church, it is, dysfunctional and corrupt. And so Luther brings a critique of the institution and then locates the ability to discern truth between the individual and God himself. And so as you know, and I'm just kind of recapping this maybe for some other listeners. As you know, like that was a revolutionary. I mean, it had obviously revolutionary impacts on church, the life of Christianity in the West, but it also had revolutionary impacts on government. So when you kind of um, invert the hierarchy to say, instead of having a institution on top which mediates for us our ability to discern truth, we have, to take like theological language, we have one high priest in Jesus Christ, one mediator, and you have access to the truth. You have the Bible in your own language. It spurs, I think, what later became kind of the ethos of the Enlightenment, of even revolutionary movements, though they might have been divorced from the theological underpinnings. There is that ethos of saying the individual can access the truth. So you take the typical modern story, especially one that has a male hero in it, and you think of figures like a Maverick in Top Gun or an Indiana Jones, a Han Solo in Star Wars. And it is this individual that says, I see the truth clearly enough
Mm-hmm.
to where I can actually rebel against these institutions.
Yeah.
And my value then is going to be waged on a meritocracy, not on my status where I was born into the particular hierarchy. For me, that seems like the modern story. Um, Stepping into like the shoes of maybe a postmodern thinker,
Mm-hmm.
Brett, why
Mm-hmm.
would anybody want to critique that story? I
Yeah.
think in the context we grew up in, though I know we come from different church traditions. I think
Mm-hmm.
by and large part the broader Protestant and evangelical world engaged with postmodern philosophy through our own lens of suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was taught early
Yeah.
on an apologetic against postmodernism before I even understood what postmodernism was. So, kind of based on what we know about the modern story, it's
Mm-hmm.
like, why would anybody want to critique that? Allowing
Mm-hmm.
ourselves to give a charitable reading
Yeah.
of postmodern critique. Can you help
Mm-hmm.
us think through where those critiques came from and why those stories? Because you're saying things like they were primarily deconstructed. They
Mm-hmm.
were critiques. They weren't really like self-sustainable stories. You haven't said
Mm-hmm.
this, but embedded in that is obviously a suspicion of any overarching guiding story.
Right.
And so, why would anybody want that? And why did that emerge from your perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I think postmodernism would argue that those stories of kind of the individual hero who has kind of a epiphany of truth are too simple, and there's self-deception where an individual who thinks that they're discovering truth isn't always aware of how their own worldview is
Mm,
created within a certain system and cultures. And there's bigger forces at work that lead to biases in certain directions. And so individuals are never the best judge. And so postmodernism would take issue with, the fact that most stories coming out of classic Hollywood tended to be told from only a particular sort of person's worldview, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, or just men in general. And so postmodernism puts a lot of value on storytellers from other perspectives that are underrepresented because they come at truth from a different lived experience and a different system. And yet, in all of it, there's self deception at play because no individual person ever kind of sees truth in its fullness. And so that leads to just an overarching skepticism about truth as a concept generally. Uh, Postmodernism, starts to make a big deal about, power is really what this is all about. Those who control storytelling in society the hegemony, as the Frankfurt School, Gramsci and Adorno would say, that they really started this kind of postmodern deconstruction of media and culture, the culture industries. They saw they saw that Hollywood and media in general wasn't this just innocuous, neutral thing. It was a tool. It was an apparatus of larger systems, governments, people in power who use these stories to kind of perpetuate their control and their power. So I think that's postmodernism's big angle. They recognize that it's self deception to think any individual is going to have like a 100% true reading of the world from their limited vantage point, and storytelling and media are inherently compromised because there's power dynamics at play. And so stories start to become less about um, artifacts just to be enjoyed, and more about artifacts to be critiqued through this kind of critical theory lens that looks at power dynamics. And I mean, I went to secular graduate school at UCLA, cinema and media studies, and that was almost everything that we
Mhm.
read was critical theory. That, it actually was a little disheartening for me as a lover of film going into that program, because I wanted to really engage film on the level of like how my heart resonated with these stories and like
Yeah,
the
appreciation
beauty
for
that was on
beauty.
display. And very little of the academic
Mm.
discussion was about that. And it was all about the power dynamics and what cultural, system is controlling this narrative, and what are the motives at work here, and, where are the underrepresented voices. And so, yeah, so I'm probably showing my cards a little bit in terms of how I look at postmodernism generally.
Mhm.
I do appreciate some aspects of it for sure. And I especially like filmmakers like Tarantino, who, come, he comes at cinema with a decidedly postmodern outlook, but he also really loves the magic of cinema, and he appreciates the resonance that viewers actually have in a sincere way with a well told story and a powerful scene. And so, even though he's deconstructing the movies as a cultural artifact, um, there's still a really heartfelt appreciation for it that comes through. And so, I've always loved his films for that reason. And maybe he would be kind of meta modern in that sense, because he
Mm.
appreciates sincerity as well as this kind of ironic detachment of postmodernism.
That's a really helpful explanation, Brett. And I think that will help us better understand the movement into metamodernism because just as you've identified that, and I think about um, we're kind of maybe we were born between worlds, in a time in which the world
Mm-hmm.
was changing. I'm not a digital native. You're not a digital native. I'm young enough or old enough, I should say, to remember that the modernist story as the central defining story of our culture. But I'm also old enough or young enough, depending how you want to put it, to have had my formative teenage and early adult years happen in the heyday of postmodern pop culture.
Yeah.
And so for me, I remember a time before it, but I try to picture what it would have been like to have been born a decade later, where postmodernism is your native tongue, and
Mm-hmm.
that is the grammar and the aesthetic that you have spent your formative years, the entirety of your life, in some sense, consuming. And it's not that people born, let's say, in the late 90s or in the early aughts, like they never got exposed to a modernist story growing
Right.
up,
It's
but
always been there. Yeah.
it's always been there. But I think postmodernism would have been the native tongue. It would have been the
Mm-hmm.
primary grammar that you would have learned to communicate and see
Yeah.
the world through. And I can just, I can imagine what that would produce in someone who
Mm-hmm.
feels a deep sense of suspicion all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like your primary mode, it sounded like what you're saying is that, in your engagement with film in graduate school, that the primary mode that you were taught to engage film with was in some ways a lens of suspicion, a lens of
Yeah.
critique. Is that a fair adjective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just kind of laying bare the apparatus at play in Hollywood and kind of uh, it was sort of a disenchantment, sort of like
Yes.
taking the magic out
Yeah.
and looking at it strictly as a cultural artifact that is being constructed in a system that has particular biases and particular, agendas. And I mean, again, there is that dynamic. That is a real thing at
Right.
play that we have to be aware of. And this is where metamodernism, I think, is right to retain some of that suspicion
Hmm.
because it is true, right? We see even today how film storytelling, television storytelling is a tool used by certain parties to advance certain narratives for particular ends. And so I think that it's more intuitive these days to just be aware of that.
Yeah.
We're not as easily duped by that. Um, but it's also not good if we only look at stories through that hyper suspicious lens where we're always on the defensive because there's something good about giving ourselves to a piece of art so that we can let it work on us and do its thing on us. And this is the constant dance that I go through as a film critic because most film critics get into this profession because they love film, right? We love the
Yeah.
magic of being in a theater and watching a movie. And I love nothing more than those kind of goosebump moments of transcendence where I'm fully immersed in a film and I'm taken into its world. And yet as a critic, I'm constantly thinking on that other plane of like,
Mm.
what might be the motivation of this filmmaker? And are there, are there other kind of entities at play behind this film trying to kind of subtly suggest certain ideas or give plausibility structures for certain worldviews. And so that's my world. So I really resonate with that kind of meta modern tension between loving sincerity, wanting to be fully invested in a story, but also seeing the value in a little bit of detachment and awareness that this is a story and it might have an agenda and it might um, not be there might be more than meets the eye basically.
Yeah, and I want to talk with you about as we get into this a little bit more about how maybe in practical ways in which we kind of do that dance of
Hmm.
being open to transcendence and
Hmm.
yet not naive. I think naivete is the primary thing that
Yeah.
the postmodern movement was calling out is like
Yeah.
you're naive about your own biases. You're naive
Yeah.
about the powers at play that are actually using these stories to maintain their power. And I think if we completely ignore that, um, there is a degree in which we ignore it at our own peril,
Hmm.
because we are we can be prone to propaganda, and I
Hmm.
think that's probably the ultimate critique is that the postmodern critique is don't be naive to propaganda,
Yeah.
and but if everything is propaganda and you've been trained to see the world that way, it maps on to me, and I know you've written about this as well. I think it maps on to Charles Taylor's work in some of
Hmm.
the, I don't know if he wouldn't say symptoms of our secular age, but I'll use the word symptoms of our secular age that
Hmm.
we have deep suspicions about transcendence. We are trapped in this immanent frame.
Yeah.
The predominant narrative worldviews within the secular spaces, the quote unquote secular spaces, the
Yeah.
spaces that are supposed to be neutral of religious perspective, has shaped us in a way so that we would by default be suspicious of transcendence. And yet we are haunted by
Hmm.
something more. I notice you writing about the subject matter,
Yeah.
writing about metamodernism, and I'm curious. I think it would be helpful for listeners to know a little bit about your
Hmm.
own personal journey
Hmm.
into a kind
Hmm.
of to me, Brett, I would see you. I don't know if you're comfortable with this term, and I would see you as a theologian of culture. I know you're not maybe explicitly working in
Hmm.
academia, and so sometimes people are hesitant to use words like theologian or philosopher unless
Hmm.
they've got their PhD and they're writing for scholarly journals. I would see you as engaging in that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's still theology of culture. When it comes to the other sorts of subdisciplines in theology, it's a pretty novel discipline. I mean, there I
Hmm.
wouldn't say 40 years ago. you could have gone to like an accredited seminary or got a graduate degree in
Yeah.
cultural theology, but it's a thing now. So how
Yeah.
did you get into it and
Yeah.
all of this stuff?
Yeah, I think the short story is I grew up as a church kid. I had two big loves in my life, Jesus, the church, and movies. And like I was like raised on Steven Spielberg films and like loved going to the movies. And I felt like those two worlds didn't intersect much. And if anything, they when they intersected, they were at odds with each other in a combative sort of way, mutually skeptical.
Was that the
So
environment of your family and church too? Was that
I think it
um
was, yeah, I grew up in the Bible Belt. I grew up in a Baptist church. It wasn't the
was
most
it
legalistic environment, I wouldn't
fairly
say.
like Christ against culture in Nigerian
Um,
terms,
I
or
I wouldn't I wouldn't put it that way.
okay?
It just wasn't like actively seeking to bring these worlds together. It just
Mhm.
like a lot of Christians, I feel like compartmentalize like their media consumption is over here. Like what they do on Netflix has nothing to do with Sunday morning. And that
Yeah,
was just kind of the world I grew up in. And
it's like
yet,
a two kingdoms approach to pop culture.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And it only really came to a head when there was like a controversial like film or like an R-rated movie full
yeah,
of sex, and that's
yeah.
where like these worlds can't just be compartmentalized; they have to be actively antagonistic. So it was only in high school when I saw Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line for the first time, which was came out when I was a sophomore in high school, and it was the first like movie theater experience where I like had an experience of transcendence watching a secular film.
Mm,
And I didn't know at the time that Malik is a Christian. He's very like self-consciously weaving in, Christian theology and biblical motifs into his films. And it was a life-changing movie-going experience for me because it gave me a vision for how fruitful a dialogue between faith and art can be. And if something as beautiful as the thin red line, is possible, then I want to devote my life to celebrating films like that and helping Christians find those movies and just engage culture in a way that's fruitful. So that's kind of where it started for me. And I started writing film reviews shortly thereafter. I went to Wheaton College as an undergrad, and I was the like film reviewer, arts and culture editor on the student newspaper. And then from there, I started writing film reviews for Christianity Today, and I became a regular like film critic for them. And then eventually, the Gospel Coalition is where I work full time as a culture editor and writer. So yeah, I mean, my whole career has been writing about film, in particular culture generally, from a distinctly Christian worldview. So the theology of culture is just what I've lived in my career. And I went to grad school. I did an MA in media studies and an MA in theology at Talbot. So I've studied both theology and culture. I haven't
mm,
finished the MA in theology. I need to finish that. But yeah, so theology of culture is a good term for it because that's how I see what I do. And I think it's an important thing because culture, I'm sure I don't have to convince you, Paul, like culture is where spiritual longings are kind of exposed. Like the stories people gravitate to, the music they love, the artists, the stars that become icons reveal our cultural longings and our spiritual longings. And so as theologians, as church leaders, we just need to be aware of that, and we need to see, you know, how in a secular age especially, how people are filling that gap of transcendence within the immanent frame, as Taylor puts it. They're often looking to pop culture to be that transcendence proxy experience. And so that just makes it a really important subject matter for us to look at. And I find it really illuminating to look at any given pop culture artifact through that lens of like, what does this reveal about our cultural spiritual longings right now, and what
mhm.
people are finding as a pseudo fulfillment for that, and how might the Christian gospel offer subversive fulfillment, in a surprising way to what these artifacts are revealing.
Who have been maybe some of the guides, whether they were people that you knew in real life
Hmm.
or philosophers, theologians, that their work has helped you engage with cultural texts well and given you different tools and lenses to have a theological engagement? Where would have been some of
Hmm.
those influences in your life?
Yeah. Um, I mean, a really important book in my development was Paul Schrader's The Transcendental Style in Film. So, Paul Schrader went to Calvin College, kind of left the faith for a while. It seems like he's come back to it a little bit. But that book was profound for me because it actually made a really interesting attempt to look at film style through the lens of transcendence, through the vocabulary of transcendence. And he's coming from a Christian worldview, trying to do that. So that book was valuable for me. I think on a more general, like cultural apologetics approach, Tim Keller just formed me in a big way. Just the way that he approached the way that he approached culture in his life was just wanting to listen to the longings that were on display and to kind of bring the gospel into that and to not just have this immediately defensive posture, although
Hmm.
at times I think he would say that defensive posture is called for, and there are Christ against culture moments for sure. So Keller was important for me, and then I'm I'm such a Malik fanboy, and
Yeah,
I
same here.
but I have to put him in the category of a formative influence as a filmmaker because I think he's doing the sort of theology of culture in
Hmm.
his very making of culture in a way that no one else is doing. So, yeah, so I think a lot of film critics and filmmakers kind of mutually inspire each other, or maybe it's more one way. The
Hmm.
filmmakers inspire the critics. No one's probably being inspired by me as a filmmaker, but I think it's a conversation, and the the person who creates amazing art makes someone like me want to be a better reader of that art and an interpreter of that art and a cheerleader for that art. And so that's why I do what I do.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love hearing the path and the journey that gets people into
Hmm.
engagement with culture on this level. Because I hear it fairly regularly from listeners. They always ask me like, "What did you read? What did you?"
Hmm.
Because it is still a fairly niche discipline, if you want to call it that. Although I do think on some level it's always happened.
Yeah.
I just don't know if we necessarily had the most helpful theological categories or the abilities to name what we were doing, to name like what is going on. So when I was younger, Brett, in like the DC Talk Jesus Freak days of evangelical
Yeah.
subculture,
Hmm.
I my parents and my family and the culture I inhabited didn't have this. It wasn't that everything that's happening in the culture outside of your church community is evil and wrong. We certainly had movie nights and things like
Yeah.
that. It
Yeah.
did seem like there was a primary mode of engagement with the broader macro culture and of suspicion about behind the macro culture were principalities and powers that were
Hmm.
anti Christ. So
Hmm.
we engaged primarily through that lens of suspicion, unless it was deemed, an appropriate thing by not only our church, but
Yeah.
things like focus on the family
Plugged
and
in,
yeah, yeah, that's that sort of stuff.
hmm.
So that was definitely I wouldn't have had language like even though Niebuhr's work had been around for forever,
Hmm.
no one that I knew was using like H.R. Niebuhr to talk about, well, we kind of have a Christ against culture disposition, and then what you and your church might be worried against is the Christ of culture thing that you might see out there where you're locating truth, locating Christ's work in culture
Hmm.
in a particular way. And I've just found to actually have an awareness of that, to actually know that there's implicit in all of our communities, an implicit theology of culture, and we just might not be aware of it. As you're saying, even with the work of Terrence Malick,
Mm-hmm.
Terrence Malick isn't writing like theological treatises.
Yeah.
He's just doing it, and there's an implied theology of culture in his work that does things like, from my
Mm-hmm.
vantage point, says, Christ is to be found in beauty.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to just make something beautiful
Yeah.
that tells a beautiful story. He's to be found in the mundane. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
have shots that zero in and focus in on mundane features of life. I think Tree of Life for me was it was Thin Red Line for you. It was Tree of Life for me that did
Mm-hmm.
that. But you used a word
Mm-hmm.
just a moment ago, longing,
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of swing this back into our
Mm-hmm.
discussion of metamodernism. I see now, through, I think, a more robust theology of culture, I see all of these, to use the language of Van Hooser, I see film as cultural texts. These are texts which are telling us things about culture's deepest longings. It is their meaning making endeavor on display. I do find on many levels, and I know there could be valid critiques of Tillich, but I do find Tillich's defining or redefining of what God is as being that which is of ultimate concern. I
Certainly.
think that's a phenomenological reality for people. It is an
Mm-hmm.
existential reality for people that, though they may not have explicit religious commitments,
Yeah.
that what functions as God in everyone's life is that which is of ultimate concern to us.
Yeah.
Even if we might name, the triune God of Orthodox Christianity or Allah in Islam, people can name, propositionally their doctrinal beliefs. But I think what we really see is existentially in our lives, um, what we pursue with our lives and what we deem of ultimate value actually functions in our life as God. So I'm always interested when I'm engaging with cultural texts to see, where are the longings for something that should be worthy of ultimate concern, worthy of our attention? Because every film, every scroll on social media, every post people make is a claim that this is worth attention.
Mm-hmm.
In the metamodern shift, Brett, what do you think you're seeing as the longings
Mm-hmm.
in our culture that people are going, I'm longing for this. I have found a bunch of counterfeit things that have clamored for my attention, and I'm going, I don't think that has been worth my ultimate concern, and I'm searching for it. What searchings and longings do you see in the
Yeah.
meta modern shift?
I think the key longing that I see is it's a term that the German Catholic theologian, writer Hartmut Rosa calls resonance. So it's this sense of it's almost like a serendipitous moment of resonance, like a holy moment encounter. Um, I think in a world of hyper consumerism, scrolling, our ephemeral content coming at us from every direction, life in the internet age is full of a lot of superficial content. We churn through Netflix shows like this and comes in one ear and out the next, and everything just feels disposable. And it might make a momentary impression, but then it's gone, right? And it's like a Snapchat story. It's like lost to the cloud. That's life in today's world, and I think that it leaves this deep hunger for something substantive, to have an encounter that's actually deep, that's profound, that causes you to stop in your tracks and to be actually affected. So much in today's technological world just doesn't register with us on anything more than a superficial scrolling level. And that's where it connects to postmodernity, which always kind of was a layer above. It is kind of this hovering, self-aware layer. It didn't allow you to go deep into kind of a profound experience of resonance. It
Mm.
created this buffer between authentic, felt experience and resonance, and an awareness of what's going on.
Because
And I think people want that.
would that sincerity be naivete. Isn't that like kind of at the concern there is if we
Hmm.
get too close to sincerity, we're
Yeah.
getting into that naivete and we
Yeah.
are probably in propaganda and self-deception or some other
Yeah.
powers manipulating us.
And I think people don't like having that buffer of suspicion that doesn't ever allow them to feel and resonate with something deeply. We want to resonate with things deeply without having these abstract concepts and qualifications and suspicions swirling around and kind of sucking the life out of it. Kind of to go back to what I was saying about my grad school experience and how I just wanted to experience the magic of film and to like celebrate that and maybe understand a little bit of how that magic happens. When you just overanalyze and deconstruct it and are constantly aware of the apparatus and the hegemony, it removes that ability. And so I think both because of postmodernism and because of our technological world, which is so inundated with content to the point that we're numb and we don't have the ability to feel and to resonate on a deep
Mhm.
level, it just makes that all the more precious of a commodity that we really seek to have those goosebump moments of resonance. And I think that's the spiritual longing, and people are looking for it. I mean, it's why um, the even like the aesthetics of Christianity appeal to some otherwise secular religion skeptical people, because to go into a cathedral and to have this encounter with the holy is awe inspiring. And it might be this place where you can have that elusive experience of resonance. And I think that's why people still go to the movies and they still watch shows. They're looking for those elusive moments, those holy moments of resonance. And there's something deeply spiritual about that,
Mm.
that's at play. So that's how I would characterize it.
Yeah. It seems like one of the primary language modes, or we might say the essential vocabulary of postmodernism was irony and the
Hmm.
use of irony to demonstrate that you were self-aware, self-aware enough that you could say to others and signal to others, yes, I know I'm in a story too,
Yeah.
because we all have this deep suspicion of meta stories. And so I have to signal to you that I'm aware that I'm in a story. In film, it might look like practically like breaking the fourth wall, a character
Yeah.
breaking the fourth wall,
Hmm.
talking to the camera, to the audience, acknowledging I'm in a story, and that heightened sense of irony. I
Hmm.
noticed, Brett, even among people and peers my age, especially those that had like an attraction to film that might be kind of in the indie hipster crowd as
Hmm.
well, that even practically it started to dawn on me maybe 10, 12 years ago how many of my friends couldn't even have a conversation in real life
Yeah.
without it being saturated with irony. Like everything
Yeah.
was irony.
Totally.
It seemed
Totally.
like a defense mechanism
Yeah.
up against authentic, sincere communication, the kind of openness that might invite pain or brokenness, or an openness that might even say, hey, I'm vulnerable to the
Yeah.
possibility of being deceived. How
Yes.
does meta modern storytelling,
Mm.
art, aesthetic, how is it navigating from your vantage point that sort
Mhm.
of inbuilt language and vocabulary of irony? Is it jettisoning it? Is it going through it? Is the irony still here? You mentioned
Mhm.
things like you mentioned examples like Wes Anderson movies, right? Those are
Mhm.
heavily ironic, but it did
Yeah.
seem like Wes Anderson was almost like using the irony in a unique
Mhm.
way. How do you see that functioning in the meta modern frame?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the early you alluded to like the early 2000s hipster culture, and I had that same experience of like I got exhausted with the fact that like it seemed like my friend group could only speak in the language of irony, and we would like watch TV shows together like ironically, and yet it was sort of pseudo enjoying it, like the show Lost, for example, which was a big thing in the early 2000s. Like we would get together, like me and a bunch of like hipster friends, and watch that show and like kind of make fun of how ridiculous it was and like the different like smoke monsters and what's going to happen next. So it was a self-aware, it was a very self-aware mode of watching, and it was like, yeah, this is total artifice. This is like sci-fi going off the rails in a bizarre way, like sort of like David Lynch, Twin Peaks level of weird.
Hmm.
But at the same time, we also enjoyed it, and we were hooked, and it was fun to like watch. And so I think metamodernism is really coming out of that early 2000s, like hyper ironic, but also we also like good stories and we like to be engrossed in good storytelling. And there's something about that, just that all in immersive experience that is fun. And we don't always need to have this layer of like deconstruction and hyper ironic awareness. So yeah, I mean, Wes Anderson is a really good example because his movies are so aware of artifice, right? Every shot is like clearly artificially constructed, and yet the characters and the stories are, it's like a self-contained world that believes in itself as a real world, and the characters and their motivations and their emotions are real, and the audience is meant to feel those real emotions. And so there's a sweetness and a sincerity to Wes Anderson's work, even though it has this like hyper stylized, kind of hyper constructed, boxy frame, every shot. So I think that's the synthesis metamodernism is trying to, like, Wes Anderson wants his audience to know that he is intelligent enough to realize that this we live in an age where we have to be aware that movies are movies and they're not real life. Now, my kind of problem, and I used to like Wes Anderson more than I do now, and maybe I'm becoming an old curmudgeon, and maybe maybe I'm becoming more modernist the older I get. But I just increasingly find myself more interested in movies that don't give that wink to the audience, that kind of breaking the fourth wall, like I know this is a movie, and I want you to know that I know that this is a movie. Like, we all know that movies are movies. I don't think anyone goes to Top Gun Maverick thinking this is real life. People know these are movies. We don't need to be told anymore through the style of a film. We don't need to raise the artifice of a film as a part of the plot. It's why I really didn't like The Fall Guy. I don't know if you saw The Fall Guy, but with Ryan Gosling. It's kind of a
Mm-mm.
movie about a stuntman.
No.
Um, but it's like a movie within a movie within a movie, and it's a movie about movie making,
Yeah.
and the whole thing. But it also tried to be a love story with Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt, and I watched that film and I was like, none of it really registered with me emotionally. The love
Mm.
story never really clicked with me because the movie was so, it was just hitting you over the head with its movie artifice that it just takes you out of the world. And so more and more I find myself, I just don't need that reminder. And I don't think audiences need that reminder. I think the reason why Top Gun Maverick was the most successful movie, of the year, box office wise, is because audiences are hungry for straightforward movies that know their movies, and audiences know their movies, and it's Tom Cruise doing crazy aerial stunts, like it's
Mm.
not real life, but they want to be able to enjoy that fictitious world because that's what stories are. They are brackets of existence where we can live in a different world for a time, and there's nothing nefarious about that. There's nothing that we need to be suspicious about. Escapism isn't bad all the time. Like, and so that's kind of where I'm landing these days. I don't love most meta modern movies because I want my stories to be all in their worlds
Mm.
and to be sincere, and I want more Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings, where it's like old school, straightforward, good storytelling, self-contained world. We all know it's not real. Orcs don't exist in real life. We all know that this is CGI, and we don't care because it's creating a world that impacts us emotionally because of its sincerity in telling the story that it's telling. So, yeah, I'm ranting at this point, but
No, no, that's good. Those are interesting thoughts. Yeah, the irony through sincerity, or I should say, the sincerity through irony mechanism.
mhm.
That seems to be the newer. grammar. We are going to try to say something sincere, but we recognize that we still have to signal to you that we are aware of our own biases.
Yeah.
And so we're going to do that still through irony, an effort to get at something sincere. We talk about longing. For me, what's behind that is a longing that maybe you're at a point, and I don't want to pedestal you or to say that others that have different
Right.
aesthetic tastes are in a different place spiritually that's inferior. But maybe it's possible, Brett, that you no longer need to signal that to anybody. Like
Mm.
this,
Mm.
the I'm self aware. It's like I think there might be a plane of spiritual formation you have ascended to where it's
Yeah.
like I just don't need that anymore. Like I'm married, I got 3 kids. I don't have to signal to anybody that I'm cool
Mm.
anymore. I've called it embracing the cringe.
Mm.
Um, Embracing the cringe being
Mhm.
the mode of authentic engagement where we are we're not branding authenticity.
Right.
Like there's like the branding of authenticity that was kind of like maybe
Mhm.
the Gen X thing, especially with
Yeah.
Gen X church.
Right.
um I'm old enough to be on that line, so this is
Mhm.
no knock against my Gen X church planters out there.
Mhm.
But there was like that we're authentic thing, and then that kind of became a brand in and of itself.
Totally. Yeah.
And for me, I think the thing I'm noticing with especially the generations younger than me is like this for me would be another flavor of metamodernism,
Mm.
is just like I think people are just comfortable embracing the cringe. So one example of
Mhm.
this, and it's so funny. Out of anything I've done, like I've been doing this kind of like public facing theology, philosophy, teaching for maybe 6 years or so.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of things we've covered, theology and science. But I swear the number one thing I hear from people is about how I predicted the comeback of Creed. And
Mm. Yes.
which is funny, but for me it was simply a matter of like assessing the cultural moment, and I started
Mhm.
to realize I noticed these like TikTok videos very early on. I'm not on TikTok, but so I'd get the recycled TikTok like a week
Mhm.
later on Instagram, and I started to notice like Gen Z, like I'd almost say unironically, but I think the term I would say is hyper ironically
Mm.
enjoying Creed.
Yeah.
And I noticed like, oh my gosh, this is what's happening is Creed was the band Creed was the quintessential 90s sincerity, right? Like
Yeah.
some might say sentimental, syrupy. From just a musical standpoint, it is not the most complex music.
Mhm.
People might have
Right.
used the term in critiques like butt rock.
Yeah.
um, and it became a thing where it was like, I remember getting that first Creed record in high school and going, I just really love this. But then
Mhm.
I was also enough a musician to have like
Mhm.
cool musician friends that were like, no, you can't like that. You have to like Radiohead. And I was like, oh, yeah. So now I'm starting to see that maybe this just is,
Totally.
I'm naive about what good music is. And then I just started noticing like
Yeah.
there are hyper ironic to the point where you might even say it's flipping back to unironic interest and engagement with Creed. Now, I think we're probably at a point now where the whole Creed thing is already cycling back
Right.
into some sort of uh, engagement that's
Mhm.
not even that. But I bring that up as an example
Mhm.
of like embracing the cringe, where people are just like, I just
Yeah.
don't care. Yeah, give me
Yeah.
some, orcs,
Yeah.
give me some Top Gun dogfights. I don't need anybody winking at the camera.
I think what people need and ultimately want is to resonate with something authentically without being self-conscious about, am I resonating with the right thing? Is it the cool
Yeah.
thing? Like, is it what everyone else says I should resonate with? We all know that that can be so artificial, right? Like, think about like an award-winning film that like is winning all the Oscars that you are supposed to like. Most of us don't, we don't always resonate with those movies, and we
Mhm.
might actually resonate with something that no one else is talking about or doesn't seem to resonate with other people. So I think we just like, maybe that's where I've come to. And I think that it's not like an elevated better than position.
Yeah.
It's just um, what I've kind of grown out of, maybe, which definitely plagued me in my early in my career as a critic. I definitely had to virtue signal in terms of like being able to like the right sorts of movies and like dislike the cringy faith-based movies and write scathing reviews of the fireproof movies and whatnot, which I did. But these days, I just I don't want to be bound by any sort of cultural expectations of what needs to resonate. Resonance is a spiritual experience where you feel the story being told and the way that it's being told is actually you're losing yourself in it in a really beautiful way. Like you're being captured by it, and so whether that happens through Creed or Coldplay, I
Mhm.
lived the whole trajectory of Coldplay in the 2000s from being like in the early Coldplay years, it was cool to like Coldplay.
Yeah,
They were
parachutes.
great. Parachutes, A Rush of Blood to the Head. Then very quickly it became very uncool to like Coldplay, and I don't know where they are now, but yeah, I don't care. Like certain Coldplay songs resonate with me, and I still love, and certain ones don't, and that's true of almost any artist or filmmaker. And so, but yeah, I do think that's part of the metamodernism longing is this idea of oscillation, which I don't
Mm.
know if you've talked about that in any of your other videos, but
No,
it,
please
one of
describe it. We've
yeah
discussed it, but I'd love to hear your view on it.
one of the key terms for meta-modern theory is oscillation, which is this very kind of fluid oscillating between flavors, if you will, of modernism and flavors of postmodernism. So you, on any given day, you might oscillate to more of an ironic kind of postmodern disposition, and then, but if you go too far in that, you kind of react and start to oscillate back to sincerity, and so it just creates this very fluid, kind of very subjective way of interacting with culture in the world, which really does boil down to this kind of like um, authentic to my own sense of resonance. Today I'm really resonating with this Top Gun Maverick movie that feels very modernist, but tomorrow I might, find a postmodernist film to be something that is resonating with me. So, yeah, that's kind of what I think people they want the freedom be um, to not be shackled to one particular way of engaging culture, one
Mhm.
particular way of being in the world. And this is where I think it becomes maybe subjective to the point of being problematic,
Mm.
metamodernism, because we're all just oscillating willy nilly on any given day. And is that really constructive culturally and as a society? It just feels very hyper subjective, and it boils down to your mood and kind of your vibe. And um, I have I have a whole like article I want to write about how vibes are the new
Mm.
substance in culture.
Mhm.
It's not engaging with the substance of any given thing doesn't seem to matter as much anymore, as much as the vibe and the aesthetic and the mood and whether something gives you the ick or not.
Yeah.
That's the new cultural mode of engaging with culture, it seems, and it feels like it dovetails with metamodernism to me, where this oscillation is very driven by mood and your kind of present disposition and how something just strikes you on any given day in any given moment. So,
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I'd encourage you to follow that trail of thought and write
mhm,
something about it because I've noticed that as well, and I've had my suspicions about whether what sort of impact our constant consumption of data and
yeah,
propositional information
yeah,
is leading us to the point where we no longer even want to go through the filtering process at all. And so
totally.
what we really want is just something that makes us feel.
Yeah,
It speaks to us at a different level of communication than the
hmm
propositional.
hmm
It speaks to us at the aesthetic. level, at the emotive level. This is a loaded term, and I don't mean to bifurcate it from the physical in any way, but at a spiritual
Hmm.
level, I think
Yeah.
that would be one suspicion I have, and I would need to think through that a little bit more, and do some more assessing to figure out whether or not
Hmm.
that would be just a correlation or a causation, a causative
Yeah, and
impact.
I think it's a lot to do with the technological mode with which we engage the world. Like in today's world where we're scrolling through things constantly, and the mental capacity we have to filter is we're just losing that because it's so overwhelming.
Yes.
So it's almost like a coping mechanism
Mhm.
to judge things on the quick glance and the impression that they make on us in the moment and the vibe that it gives
Mhm.
off. That is, I think, it's a byproduct of just the technological environment that we're in. I don't think it's a I don't think it's a self-conscious choice to like disengage with arguments and substance. I think it's more of a mental coping mechanism in this world where we're flooded with so many incongruous, your Twitter feed, your X feed is like just like one argument next to a totally contradictory argument, next to a cat video, next to
Mhm.
a picture of a flood and a natural disaster. Like it's
Yeah.
just all so overwhelming that we can't help but start to respond to the world based on just the quick impression and the vibe. And, we make that choice to click on something less on a rational basis and more on a kind of impressional kind of vibe basis. So I think there's huge ramifications for the church and for Christianity in a world of vibes becoming more important than arguments or logic. That obviously has huge implications for the church and apologetics and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, not to move into the political sphere not too long, but that was one of the observations I made to my wife this morning
Mm,
after just tuning into the debate a little bit
hmm.
last night. And
Yeah.
my observation to her was, I don't think people really get that. It seemed like, I didn't watch the whole thing, but it seemed like they were doing some form of try to like live fact checking, like having
Hmm.
fact checking
Hmm.
mid debate, and it would be my sentiment, and this is not partisan. This is a nonpartisan perspective. My sentiment would be, I just don't think people in those positions understand how irrelevant the
Yeah.
fact checking venture
Right.
is,
Yeah.
and I think it would be more helpful for them to understand that no matter the side, um, I think the most successful politicians in our day and age, successful in terms of garnering attention. I don't mean successful in actually bringing about a more just
Hmm.
and
Right.
a
Right.
world. I'm saying
Yes.
successful in being reelected and achieving election results. The most successful ones are the ones tapping into the vibes,
Hmm.
you
Yeah,
know?
for sure.
So if you can even name, um, something that
Yeah.
doesn't communicate propositionally accurate
Mhm.
information, but
Mhm.
you're tapping into what people feel,
Yes.
you are very, and that may be historically true
Mhm.
in the political sphere, but it seems even more so now that
Mm.
these are not even about, and what happens on social media and what we find ourselves most interested in. It's not rational.
Yeah.
It's not like rational deduction where I'm like, oh, I'm
Mhm.
really, for most people, I think
Mm.
many people, this could be like you're saying, it could be that we are overloaded with
Mhm.
information, and it could be that this information overload, we just are too tired to filter anything else more. It could
Mhm.
also be a way of dealing with grief and loss, that we all have gone through things, and a change in our world, a change and a loss of, John Vervaeke, a cognitive scientist, calls it domicide.
Mm.
Domicide, the feeling that we've lost something of home,
Yeah.
because the rate of change has happened so fast, and so that puts us into that sort of
Mm.
grief
Mhm.
mode. And I don't know about you, but in my experience in my day job,
Mhm.
it's not like I tell people things that aren't true, but I recognize when people are grieving, they're not actually not they're not necessarily looking for you to tell them something true in the
Yeah.
moment. Does that make sense? Like, it's not that we lie to people intentionally, but you have to understand when people are in that
Hmm.
mode, what they're looking for is comfort, and they are looking for someone to affirm their feelings.
Yeah.
And that might be the vibe that we're getting at. What do you think, Brett?
Mm-hmm.
Just like one final question for you, and I always have an eye towards the recognition that the demographic of this podcast is, by and large part, people that have had come from some sort of particular Christian past or upbringing, or is currently in Christian
Hmm.
community. But there is a segment of the regular audience that's just as interested in the subject matter and interested in religious ideas. So having
Yeah.
kind of an eye towards both people, Brett. I am curious about what you think the impacts of metamodernism is on Christianity in the West, and maybe even if you feel like naming specifically how you see it impacting like your particular tradition and
Hmm.
the churches and the spheres of influence that you maybe most directly speak to.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have thought recently, and I need to think more about this and maybe explore writing about this, but I sort of see a parallel with metamodernism and what we call post-Christianity, which is a term that in Western cultures, so America, Europe, we now more and more we describe it as a post-Christian culture. And one of the hallmarks of a post-Christian culture is that it comes after Christianity, but it can't get away from Christianity, right? In the same way that uh, metamodernism comes after postmodernism and modernism, but can't get away from them. And so just like metamodernism sort of takes pieces of each of the systems that came before it and kind of assembles a amalgamation of something that takes from both. Post Christianity is interesting because you find a lot of people who don't reject everything about Christianity. Like they like the world Christianity made, right? In
Mhm.
terms of um,
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, like there's more and more people, even like
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins is starting to say stuff like this, like
Yeah.
hardened atheists who used to be like rabid antagonists towards
Mhm.
Christianity are starting to talk about how there's aspects of Christianity that have been good for the world and we need to appreciate that. And so in post Christianity, it's like we retain some of the good virtues of Christianity while rejecting other things and rejecting this kind of all in membership in institutional Christianity. That's the part that we're suspicious about, particularly the institutional part. But if we can kind of pick and choose elements of it as a very hyper subjective oscillating individual where like maybe on one day I do want to go to church and have like a spiritual experience in this awesome cathedral, but then the next week I'm not going to go and I'm going to go do, something else. I feel like there's a corollary there with metamodernism in terms of this. There's both in both situations. There's a longing for resonance. There's a longing for some ability to puncture the kind of buffered self, the immanent frame, to kind of reach beyond and encounter transcendence. But there's a hesitance to go all in on that because there's fear associated with um,
Mhm.
just being duped and being naive and being kind of manipulated by religious institutions or abused by religious institutions or whatever. So I think that's really what I see the church's challenge being in the meta modern world, um, in the post Christian world, is how do we engage people who still appreciate things about Christianity and might give themselves to church at various moments, but only like half heartedly and only kind of putting one foot in. And how do we persuade them to kind of go all in and kind of fully devote themselves, fully commit to Christianity and all of its confession and all of its outworking in life when there is so much understandable suspicion and
Mhm.
when the kind of postmodern hermeneutic of suspicion is still so prevalent. for good reason, right? Like there's a lot of things that have gone wrong in institutional
Mm.
Christianity, and people are maybe right to be skeptical. And so, but at the same time, we can celebrate the fact that even though they're skeptical, there's still a magnetic draw that they have towards certain Christian virtues and certain aesthetics of Christian worship, and even the longing for community that church provides in a lonely age of, individualistic scrolling, where people are just in this loneliness epidemic. The longing for the community that a church provides is something that I think we can celebrate and lean into. So, yeah, so I think it's going to be interesting to see how the church responds to this push and pull of post-Christian culture, where there's certain aspects of Christianity that still draw people and pull people, just as modernism still draws people in some ways,
Mm.
but it also repels people in other ways, and Christianity still repulses people and gives people the ick. It
Mm.
gives off bad vibes in a lot of ways, and we have to reckon with that. And I don't think the answer is we, become hyper self-aware as the church and make sure like every vibe we're putting off is perfectly palatable for Gen Z. I've written
Mm.
about that. I've critiqued that. My book Hipster Christianity was one long book length critique of churches that are too concerned with kind of scratching where there's itches in our culture. Like we have to be confident in who we are as the church, even as we are in conversation with the culture on the level of its longings. And that kind of connects to all that we've been talking about with cultural theology and being aware of longings. It's not a compromise for the church to be in conversation with secular culture and to hear it out and to listen to its grievances about the church and to listen to the longings of like what they respond to in Christianity, what they don't respond to. We can do that in a way that doesn't shape shift who we are as the church to fit exactly what post-Christian people want, what meta-modern people want, because that's a moving object. That itself is a hyper shape-shifting
Mm.
moving target, and we would be foolish to change, Christianity to try to follow that rabbit trail.
Yeah, that seems like
So yeah,
that gets at the perennial
yeah,
question of
yeah,
how, I mean, that's his neighbor's question. Is like, cultures always shift and change, and yet you were
yeah,
saying as a core Christian belief that there is a timelessness to the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and yet how do you communicate it within a
hmm,
shifting culture that has different the symbols change in their meaning,
right,
the grammar changes and shifts, and
yeah,
so how does one do that in a meta modern frame, which appears like it's the rate of cultural change is exponentially higher with social media,
yeah,
the dissemination and exchange of ideas that sort of like maybe for lack of a better term, that Hegelian process of thesis, now antithesis, and then you get some new
hmm,
synthesis.
yeah,
Seems like that change, who knows, metamodernism might go be here and gone
yeah,
in a much quicker passing of time than postmodernism was. So
yeah,
yeah, there is that tension of how do you communicate these essential uh, features of what
yeah,
it means to say be a disciple of Jesus in a
yeah,
way that speaks within the cultural context and the cultural grammar without changing the original meaning and intent
mm,
somehow in the process is messy. How do you see it happening maybe within your particular context, Brett? I from
hmm,
my vantage point, I've noticed maybe an increasing interest in the sorts of liturgies of church traditions like Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and even there seems to be a surging interest in the Anglican tradition, and in some
hmm,
part because I see people as interested in the ritual, the
yeah,
liturgy, and the appreciation of beauty that they might find more native to those practices, or at least maybe they're alien in some sense.
yeah,
There's a foreignness to stepping into the
mm,
basilica not far down the road from me that is different than maybe, kind of a typical evangelical church plant that might feel not too dissimilar than stepping into a concert
Yeah,
venue or a movie
totally.
theater. So there's something like alien that conveys mystery and
Yeah.
wonder. Finally, Brett, is just one real final tag on question here. How are
Yeah.
you seeing within your particular tradition and context, as I'd understand it, you're primarily writing within the context of speaking to those in the more reformed tradition. I don't know if that's a
Mhm.
fair assessment or
Yeah.
not. And it seems like one of the points of struggle, or maybe the points of tension within the reformed tradition, has been like how central do we maintain like proclamation of the gospel in the form of a sermon being like the centerpiece of liturgy, up
Mhm.
against things like the arts and beauty. There's been critiques, from other traditions that, well, the reformed tend to be a little more Spartan.
Yeah.
You walk into their church,
Right.
you're not going to see ornate, stained glass perhaps in the same way. How are
Mhm.
you navigating and seeing people in your particular tradition navigate that question?
Mm. Yeah. I've been encouraged in my role. So I'm the arts and culture editor for the Gospel Coalition. So I'm very tuned into like who is out there in our tribe in the reformed world, like making good art and good music, and they do exist. And so I've seen firsthand that there is a lot of appreciation of beauty and an appreciation not just of the pedagogical value of
Mm.
like doctrinally rich song, which is good. Like the Gettys, have
Yeah,
written
for sure. Mhm,
some of the biggest contemporary hymns have come out of
mhm,
a kind of reformed theological tradition that the Gettys represent, and City of Light is another
mhm.
example.
Yeah.
So but even just a value of art in and of itself as kind of a beautiful sphere of creating for the glory of God, right? Art for God's sake. I think that was the title of a book by Philip Ryken, who president of Wheaton College, Reformed, Christian. So I think there's even though preaching is still central in this kind of propositional doctrinal is this kind of the North Star for sure in the Reformed tradition. There's an appreciation of the forms of beauty and
Mm.
aesthetics as um, kind of a sphere that's worth exploring and celebrating. Kind of the Kuyperian,
Yeah.
Abraham Kuyper's,
Mhm,
Reformed Dutch Reformed thinker. His looking at all of the spheres of creation are under God's sovereignty, so we need to value all of it and you know look at art as an arena where God is glorified. So I've been encouraged by it. And one other thing I would say that connects to what you were saying about the appeal of Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Um, I've also seen a corollary to that in the Protestant Reformed tradition is a resurgence of classical theology and
yeah.
retrieval,
Great
uh,
point. Yeah.
looking to the past
Mhm,
a more intentional looking to what is ancient and very, very old, and recognizing. And I think part of this uh, comes from just the dizzying speed of change and the ephemeral. Everything today just feels so ephemeral and disposable and overwhelming. And we're starting, maybe as a culture, we're starting to wake up to the fact that what is old and has endured is something we should pay more attention to, right? That maybe that's why classical education is having a
mhm,
resurgence, classical Christian schools and great books education. um, so I think all of that is connected to this sense of temporal uh, dislocation that we experience in today's world, this ahistorical, hyper presentist focus on what's trending now that we'll forget next week. It's
mhm,
very
mhm.
empty and it
Yeah.
doesn't nourish our souls. It doesn't create wisdom in us. And so that's why people are drawn to the older Christian traditions. And I think it's partly aesthetic. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that, become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox for aesthetic reasons. But I think it's
Mhm.
also for just there's something more trustworthy about time tested
Yeah.
teaching and tradition that has not changed all that much in thousands of years or centuries. Um, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that became more of a thing in the years to come, where the appeal of the old and the enduring starts to loom a bit larger in terms of where people look for that resonance, that transcendence that they feel lacking in their lives.
Hmm. Wonderful. Brett, this has been awesome. It's been great to get connected with you. I'm really thankful that you've been able to be gracious enough to set aside some time in your busy schedule to have this conversation. And I know it's going to be beneficial to a lot of people. I'm going to make sure in the description below, everyone, that you will be able to find links to where you can follow Brett and his work. And if you've liked what you've heard from him today, this is just a little bit of the many things I've read from him over the years. Do you have any other new books on the horizon, Brett? Are you doing any larger writing projects?
Yeah, so kind of pertinent to some of what we discussed, I edited a book with Crossway and TGC called Scrolling Ourselves to Death. It's coming out in April. It's an homage to Neil Postman's Using Ourselves to Death, which turns 40 next year in 2025. So this book that I edited with Ivan Mesa, it's kind of a volume of chapters from different contributors looking at digital technology and how it intersects with the theology and church practices and being wise Christians in our digital age. So I'm really excited about it. I think it's a necessary. We need more books like this. There's more and more books coming out on these topics, and I'm really happy about that. But that's my next book project.
Awesome, awesome. Well, best of luck as you endeavor to complete that and to get that out in the world. We know that's a difficult process. But thank you again, Brett, for your time, and I appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you, Paul.
I don't run ads in the middle of my podcast because of the generous support of listeners just like you over on Patreon. Extra special thanks to Clint, Brandon, Daniel, Dave, Eli, Garth, Jean-Marc, Jesse, John Mark, Josie, J. Tom, Justin, Kate, Luke, Matthew, Mike, Nick, Paul, Rob, Sam, Stephen, Tim. Thank you all for your generous support.